The air in the dining room was thick, not with the smell of the overcooked meatloaf, but with a suffocating, clinical disdain that felt like a physical weight against my chest. I sat there, my arthritic fingers trembling slightly as I tried to navigate a fork through peas that tasted like dust, while the silence of the room was punctuated only by the aggressive clinking of Samantha's cutlery against her porcelain plate. She didn't look at me. She looked through me, as if I were a piece of old, unwanted furniture taking up valuable square footage in a house I had once filled with lullabies and the scent of fresh baking. Then, the silence broke, not with a whisper, but with a serrated edge that sliced right through the remains of my dignity. "You eat, but you don't help," she said, her voice landing like a cold stone in still water, ripples of cruelty spreading across the table. My son, Jason, the boy I had worked double shifts for, the man whose fevered brow I had wiped through 1,000 childhood illnesses, did not look up. He kept his head down, shoveling food into his mouth with a rhythmic, mechanical desperation, his silence a louder betrayal than any shout could ever be. Even my grandson, usually a whirlwind of noise, went unnervingly still, his wide eyes darting between the adults as he sensed the invisible blood on the floor. I didn't cry. I didn't plead. I didn't remind them that these hands, now stiff and swollen, had built the very foundation of their comfort. I simply placed my fork down, the metallic clack sounding like a gavel in a courtroom where I had already been found guilty of the crime of growing old. That night, the guest room, a glorified storage cupboard with a ceiling fan that clicked like a ticking time bomb, felt like a cage. I lay there staring at the ceiling, listening to the muffled sounds of their laughter drifting from the living room, the clink of wine glasses, the hum of a life that had decided I was no longer a lead character, just a background extra waiting for the final curtain. The coldness settled into my marrow, a quiet resignation that wasn't born of this single insult, but of 1,000 tiny erasures over the years. I thought of my late husband, how we had fought for every brick of this house, and how he had died with a dignity I was now being denied. I remembered the dry cleaners, the steam burning my face for pennies so Jason could have the best cleats, the best books, the best start. And now I was just a mouth to feed. The betrayal tasted more bitter than any medicine. I stayed for 2 more days, a ghost moving through the hallways, folding laundry they didn't thank me for, picking up toys that tripped my aching knees, and making coffee that they drank without a glance in my direction. When they left for their couple's weekend, a trip I was pointedly excluded from because Samantha needed space, the house became a hollow shell. I packed 1 suitcase. No note, no dramatic scene. Just a house key placed precisely on the kitchen table, next to a folded dish towel. A final act of service for a family that had already forgotten my name. The bus ride across Pennsylvania was a blur of gray skis and rain-streaked windows. My destination wasn't a luxury retreat. It was a modest care home that smelled of bleach and boiled peas, a place where the forgotten go to wait for the end. The woman at the front desk gave me a look of practiced pity, but I met it with a smile that felt like a mask. Inside, I was hollow, wondering if I truly had become the burden they said I was. But in the quiet of that narrow room, as I watched the shadow of a tree dance against the wall, a spark of fire, long dormant, began to flicker. I remembered a name, James Callahan, my husband's oldest friend, the man who handled the messy paperwork of death and taxes. When I called him, my voice was a thread of silk, thin but unbreakable. "James," I said, "do you remember the house deed?" There was a pause on the other end, a heavy, knowing silence. "I remember everything about that day, Ruth," he replied. 3 days later, I stood in his office, surrounded by the scent of old leather and the weight of legal secrets. He slid a folder across the mahogany desk, and as I opened it, the world stopped spinning. There it was, my name, the address, the signature of my husband from 1994, witnessed and notarized. The house, the one Samantha claimed was hers, the one Jason allowed her to treat like a weapon against me, was mine. It had always been mine, fully, legally, irrevocably. I looked at the paper, and for the first time in years, the tremor in my hands stopped. My husband, even as cancer was stealing his breath, had been building a fortress for me. He knew. He had seen the future even then. "She built this family," he had told James. "She should never have to ask to stay in her own home." The realization hit me like a physical blow. I hadn't been a guest in their house. They had been guests in mine, and they had been very, very rude guests. I looked at James, my eyes sharpening with a clarity that had no room for maternal mercy. "I want to sell it," I whispered, the words tasting like iron. "I want to sell it quietly, James. I want them to hear it from the bank, not from me." He didn't blink. He knew the cost of silence better than anyone. As I left his office, the folder pressed to my chest like a shield. The world looked different. The rain didn't feel cold. It felt like a cleansing. I wasn't an old woman who just ate. I was a woman who held the keys to their entire world, and I was about to turn the lock. Back at the care home, I shared tea with Helen, a woman who had been discarded just like me, her daughter-in-law making her eat in the laundry room. As we sat in the fatting light, I realized that my story wasn't ending. It was just getting to the part where the villain realizes the hero was never actually defeated. I began to plan. Not just a sale, but a legacy. A place for the Helens of the world. A place where utility wasn't the price of admission for love. 6 months passed. I watched the seasons turn from my narrow window, watching the leaves die and fall, knowing that beneath the frozen earth, something was preparing to bloom. I worked with James in secret, every document a stitch in a new garment of freedom. The house in the suburbs was in a prime location, the market was hungry, and the offer that came in was more than enough to change everything. When the final papers were signed, I didn't feel a pang of guilt. I felt a profound sense of balance. The meal I had supposedly been eating for free had been paid for 30 years in advance with sweat, blood, and a mother's bottomless patience. Now the bill was due. The notification arrived at their door via certified mail on a Tuesday, a day like any other until it wasn't. I could almost hear the scream across the miles. My phone began to vibrate, a frantic, rhythmic buzzing that I ignored with the calm of a woman who had already said everything she needed to say. Jason called. Samantha called. They left messages that transitioned from confusion to anger to absolute shattered disbelief. "You evil old woman," Samantha's voice shrieked through the voicemail. "You sold our home." I picked up the phone finally, my voice as steady as a heartbeat. "No, Samantha," I said. "I sold my home. You just lived there rent-free, exactly like you accused me of doing. Now it's someone else's turn." The silence that followed was the sweetest sound I had heard in decades. But the true shock was yet to come. I wasn't just taking their roof. I was building a sanctuary, and the guest list didn't include them. As I stood on the porch of the dilapidated building I had just purchased, the future Haven House, I knew the cliffhanger of my life had finally reached its resolution. I was no longer the burden. I was the architect of a new world, and the foundation was made of the very stones they had thrown at me. The phone call from Jason came the next morning, not with Samantha's shrill, performative outrage, but with a raw, childish desperation that twisted my gut, a ghost of the boy who used to cling to my leg. "Mom," he whispered, his voice cracking, the carefully constructed facade of the successful, indifferent son crumbling. "We're going to lose everything. Samantha, she's crying every day. We have nowhere to go. The kids—" He let the words hang, heavy with accusation and unasked pleas. The silence that followed was deliberate, a canvas on which I painted my own, long-overdue truth. I let him speak, let him lay bare the wreckage of a life built on assumption and entitlement. When he finished, I didn't argue. I didn't accuse. I simply delivered the lines I had rehearsed in the quiet moments of my new, peaceful existence. "Jason," I said, my voice steady, devoid of the maternal warmth he once took for granted. "I'm not taking anything from you. I'm only reclaiming what you thought I had forgotten. I'm not asking for your love, I'm asking for recognition." The pause that followed was deafening, pregnant with the weight of 30 years of unspoken sacrifices. Then came the inevitable, the desperate gamble of a man who suddenly saw his world burning. "Is there any way you can undo it?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. And I gave him the truth, cold and unvarnished. "Jason, I gave everything to raise you, and I never kept score. But the moment your wife opened her mouth and you said nothing, something changed. I don't want your money. I don't even want your apology. I just want my silence back, and this is how I earn it." The line went dead. And for the first time, it was okay. I had said what needed to be said. I wasn't rescuing anyone. I was simply standing up for the version of me they thought would stay quiet forever. That night, I sat with a cup of tea, the same kind I used to serve them with Sunday pancakes and maple syrup, only this time, the sweetness was mine alone. Peace, like revenge, had no need to shout. It simply arrived. There is a drawer in every mother's life that holds more than it seems. Mine was small, wooden, tucked beneath a dusty lamp in the corner of my room at Haven House. It held birthday cards, prayer beads, faded photographs, and one leather-bound notebook. My husband gave it to me on our 25th anniversary. On the first page, in his elegant handwriting, it read, "For the things we never want to forget." And I hadn't. That evening, after Samantha's voice had stopped ringing in my ears, I opened that drawer with hands steadier than I expected. The notebook smelled faintly of lavender and thyme, a ghost of happier times. At first, it had been a place for shopping lists and recipes, quick notes from church sermons, a reminder to send a thank you card. But over time, it had transformed quietly, organically into something else, into a record. Not of bitterness, not of blame, but of love. The kind given over and over without ever being returned as a receipt. I turned the pages, each entry a small, precise incision into my own history. 1994, Jason's tuition after he dropped out, $2,300. A memory of late nights working, of a future I'd envisioned for him, now just a faded number. 1996, co-signing the car loan, paid the first 5 months, $1,800. The worry, the quiet fear that he wouldn't make the payments, absorbed without a word. 1999, emergency room bill. Jason refused to let Samantha's insurance pay $740. The sharp sting of his disregard, softened by my own instinct to protect. 2001, wedding gift. So you can have a real honeymoon, $5,000. A sacrifice for a love that would never truly cherish me in return. 2005, covered rent for 3 months during unemployment, $3,600. The silent struggle, the fear in their eyes, eased by my steady hand. 2008, bought crib and stroller for first grandchild, $1,200. The joy, the fleeting hope that this new life would bring them closer, only to be swallowed by indifference. And on, for 30 years of quiet generosity, moments I had forgotten until now, until being called a burden forced me to account for what I had carried. I kept reading, each entry a new stab of quiet pain. 2011, down payment for their second car, $4,000. Another new car, another fresh start, another debt I unknowingly shouldered. 2013, replaced their water heater when it broke, $950. A freezing shower, a desperate call, and my immediate, unhesitating help. 2015, helped with IVF costs, $7,000. The desperate hope for a sibling, a hope I nurtured with my own savings. 2017, paid for Samantha's dental surgery, $2,100. The glint of resentment in her eyes, even as I handed her the check. 2020, pandemic groceries, $4,500 across 5 months. The fear in their voices, the empty shelves, and my unwavering presence. The total, over $120,000, maybe more. I had never calculated it before, never dared to quantify the invisible ledger of my love. But now they had forced me to. I remembered whispering to myself, I used to give without keeping track, but they made me start counting. And it broke my heart to see it all laid bare, not because I regretted it, but because they had pretended it never happened. So I made copies, each page neatly labeled and organized. I gave it to James, my lawyer, as a kind of living will, a testament not of material wealth, but of maternal labor. This isn't for revenge, I told him, my voice steady. This is so that someday, if they ask why, I won't have to say a word. The numbers will speak for themselves. He looked at me across his mahogany desk and nodded slowly. You're not wrong, Ruth, he said. You're just finally being honest about what it cost. I smiled faintly, not from satisfaction, but from clarity. Because I had loved them more than they'd ever noticed, and now I had proof that my silence hadn't meant absence. It had meant sacrifice. That night, I placed the original notebook back in its drawer, but this time I added one final entry. 2023, sold the house. Built a new one for women like me, called it Haven House. Worth $0 in interest value, immeasurable. I closed the book and whispered, they thought I was just an old woman who ate without giving, but I fed them daily for decades, and now I'm finally feeding myself. When the house sold, the money didn't feel like triumph, it felt like closure. I didn't spend it on cruises or new clothes or revenge. I didn't want to teach them a lesson. I wanted to build something that spoke louder than resentment. So I went looking not for a place to live, but for a purpose. It started with a visit to a small building on the east side of town, 4 units, faded paint, a sagging porch that needed new wood. But it had good bones, and it was quiet. The agent looked at me like I was lost. Most folks your age look for retirement communities, she said, her voice laced with thinly veiled judgment. This isn't exactly luxury. I'm not looking for luxury, I replied, my gaze fixed on the quiet potential of the building. I'm looking for use. I bought it that day. Then I named it Haven House. Below the nameplate, I added a simple phrase engraved into the wood. No one here proves their worth to stay. I didn't want it to be just a shelter. I wanted it to be a balm and a place for women like me, like Helen, like the many invisible elders who'd been told they were burdens, who had been tolerated, not loved, dismissed, not cherished. It took a few weeks to get things in shape. I hired a local handyman, Tommy, whose mother had been in a care home too. He worked weekends for free once he learned what the house would be. You're building something good, he said, his eyes filled with genuine admiration. Feels rare these days. We painted walls, planted herbs in old bathtubs turned into garden beds, and furnished the rooms with warmth instead of price tags. Soft chairs, good lighting, a kettle always ready. I invited Helen to be the first resident. She cried when she walked in, her frail body shaking. You didn't forget me, she whispered, her voice a fragile testament to the years of being unseen. Of course not, I said, my own voice thick with emotion. We remember those who have been forgotten. Over time, we welcomed 3 more, all women with stories etched into the lines around their eyes. Some had been cast out by children, others had outlived everyone they ever loved. There was Miss Beatrice, who used to be a school teacher. She still corrected our grammar with a wink. There was Marion, who once ran a flower shop and now grew basil on the windowsill like it was her life's prize. And there was Roland, our first man, a widower who cooked better than any of us and always had a joke ready. I became the unofficial manager. I bought groceries, organized doctor visits, helped them review their legal papers when needed. On Thursdays, I brewed tea and read the local paper aloud. On Sundays, we played records and danced in socks on the wood floor. One day, Roland paused while slicing tomatoes and looked at me across the counter. You know, he said, a glint in his eye, we're alive today because someone once called you a leech. I froze, then laughed, a deep, stunned laugh that echoed through the quiet kitchen. Ironic, isn't it? I said. He nodded. You turned pain into shelter. That's more than most ever manage. That night, I wrote a new entry in my notebook. They called me a burden, but with the money from that burden, I'm feeding 4 souls who now sleep in peace. The house didn't have locks on the inside doors, not because we didn't value privacy, but because we had nothing to hide. We trusted each other, in ways our own families had failed to do. One evening, as the sun poured golden over the porch, I stood with Helen, holding mugs of chamomile tea. It feels good to be happy again, she said softly, her eyes distant yet peaceful. You're not alone, I told her, and she smiled. Neither are you. And for once, I believed it, because Haven House wasn't just walls and windows, it was a statement, a memory turned into meaning. Every laugh, every shared meal, every quiet nap in the sunlit chairs was proof that I was never just someone who ate and did nothing. I had been someone who gave, who endured, who remembered. And now I was someone who rebuilt. This place, this haven, was the shocking entry I never knew I was capable of. It was my answer to their neglect, a testament to the power of a woman finding her voice, not through anger, but through unwavering, profound action. It was the quiet, dignified rebellion of a mother who finally chose herself, and in doing so, created a home for a new, chosen family. The betrayal hadn't broken me. It had forged me anew into a protector, a builder, a silent force that had reshaped her own destiny and the destinies of others who had also been cast aside. He came to see me on a Tuesday, not with the arrogance of the man who allowed his wife to insult me, nor with the rehearsed excuses of a son who forgot his mother's heart. He came with the kind of silence that only total desperation brings. It had been almost a year. I recognized him instantly from the porch of Haven House, though he looked older, not by the passage of time, but by the weight of a burden he finally had to carry himself. His shoulders were hunched, his eyes, my God, his eyes were nothing like the boy who once begged me to stay a little longer at bedtime. He walked up the gravel path, his footsteps heavy, hesitant, as if the very ground I owned was now forbidden to him. I know I don't deserve to be here, he said quietly, standing at the foot of the stairs. I said nothing. I just motioned for him to sit in the chair beside mine. The same chair where I had sat with Helen, where I had reclaimed my soul. We lost the house, he continued, his voice a hollow echo of his former self. Samantha left. She said I should have fought harder, that I was weak. But I didn't know what to say back then, Mom. I didn't know how to choose. His voice cracked on the word Mom, a sound that used to shatter me but now only felt like a distant vibration. We have nothing now. I sleep on a friend's couch. I work nights at a warehouse. I wanted to say I'm sorry for everything. Still, I said nothing. Instead, I reached into the small wooden box I kept beside my chair. From it, I pulled out a single photograph. It showed the early days of Haven House, the porch still unpainted, the garden bare, but in the center, 4 people were laughing, holding paintbrushes, shoes kicked off, a house becoming a home. I handed it to him. He looked down at it, confused at first, then the realization dawned on him like a slow, painful sunrise. "You built this," he whispered, his fingers tracing the edge of the photo. "With the money from our house." I nodded slowly, the sun catching the silver in my hair. "And you didn't spend it on yourself," he added, looking at the mismatched furniture and the humble garden. I shook my head. "I spent it on something that could grow, Jason. I spent it on the dignity you told me I no longer possessed." He looked back at the photo, then up at me, his eyes searching for a mercy I had already given to others. "Why?" he asked. "Why go through all this?" I finally spoke, my voice as calm as the evening breeze. "Because I ate your rice for 1 year, Jason, but you ate mine for 30. I'm only collecting a little interest." His mouth opened, then closed. No words came. I stood up, my legs ached more these days, a reminder of the years spent standing for him, but I stood tall. "I didn't come here to hurt you," he finally said, his head bowing in shame. "I know," I replied. "I just wanted to say thank you for everything I never said thank you for. I was blind." I studied him, the stubble on his chin, the worry lines his youth once smoothed over. "There's something you still need to understand," I said, leaning in so he could see the clarity in my eyes. "I never needed repayment. I needed respect. I needed to know my years weren't a race because I slowed down. I needed to know that the hands that once held your fevered head weren't suddenly useless because they trembled." He lowered his eyes, the tears finally spilling over. "I forgot who you were," he whispered. "No," I said. "You remembered too late." A long pause followed, filled only by the sound of Miss Beatrice humming inside the house. Then he asked the question I knew was coming. "Can I help with the house, with the other residents? I want to make it right." I shook my head gently. "This place doesn't need your guilt, Jason. It needs your growth. Live better, love better. That's how you honor what I gave you." He nodded slowly as he rose to leave. As he reached the gate, I called out to him one last time. I reached into the box and handed him a copy of the deed, not to Haven House, but to his own future. It was a blank, white page I had tucked into the folder months ago. "Go fill this with something worthy," I said. He held that empty paper like it was made of solid gold. "I will," he promised, and for the first time in a decade, I believed him. It was a quiet spring afternoon, the kind that moved slowly, as if the day itself had nowhere urgent to be. Breeze wandered through the trees like it was browsing a familiar bookstore, unhurried in content, while the scent of wild lilac and distant rain folded into the air like an old memory returning home. I sat back down on my porch, my chipped teacup in hand. I watched the late sun stretch long shadows across the yard, laying soft gold on the gravel path and coaxing warmth out of the flagstones. Helen sat under the pergola, arguing playfully with Roland about whether to steam or sauté the green beans. Miss Beatrice was on the swing, her hands moving steady through loops of yarn. You might think this place is a care home, but you'd be wrong. This wasn't a place to be taken care of. This was a place where people remembered how to belong. These weren't just elderly residents. They were stories still unfolding, no longer shelved behind family pity. I had just taken a sip of tea when I noticed a woman approaching from the gate. I didn't recognize her, thin, elegant, wearing a Sunday hat too formal for a Tuesday. She sat beside me without asking. "You're the owner?" she asked. I nodded. She looked around the yard, the homemade wind chimes made of old cutlery, the riot of mismatched flowers. "This place feels free," she said, almost like a confession. She looked at me, studying my lined face and the tremor in my hand that I no longer tried to hide. "Why don't you live with your children?" she asked gently. I didn't answer right away. I let the question float light as pollen in the afternoon air, then I smiled. "I used to," I said. "But here I'm needed, not tolerated. No one here asks me to mop the floors to earn my meals. No one expects me to apologize for being alive." Her eyes softened, and I knew she understood. We sat in silence, the kettle whistling from inside, an old friend calling me back to the warmth. "I think I get it now," she said softly. I nodded. You don't always have to win the fight. Sometimes just walking away is the loudest thing you can do. The sun dipped lower, brushing amber onto every leaf and every wrinkle. This was my justice. Not a courtroom, not revenge, just a chair on a porch, and the knowledge that I had built something that outlived bitterness. This was the most beautiful kind of beginning. If you've ever been called a burden, if you've ever stayed silent just to keep the peace, hear this. You are not alone. I'm a mother from Pennsylvania, and I have lived this. I have reclaimed every dollar and every whispered insult. Love isn't always soft. Sometimes, love is leaving without slamming the door and building something new for the strangers who need you. Haven House is a statement that we do not have to die quietly. I didn't start out brave. I started out broken. But piece by piece, I remembered who I was. And you can too. It is not too late. You are not too old. You are not the problem. You are a chapter they didn't finish reading, but that doesn't make it the end of your book. If this story stirred something in you, if you're ready to remember who you are, then subscribe to Grandma True Stories. Here, every sacrifice is remembered and every tear has a reason. Welcome home. Question: if you were in this mother's position, would you have given your son a second chance to help with the new house? Yes/no.